All right, let's try this one more time. Once again, my name is Lallen Johnson. I'm an assistant professor of criminology and justice studies at Drexel University. And I'm joined by some really great company. So to my left, we have, if I get this correct, Natalye Paquin, CEO of the Girl Scouts of Eastern Pennsylvania. We also have on this panel Reverend Dr. Alyn E. Waller, senior pastor at Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And forgive me, but I did not have the pleasure of meeting our last panelist, so I'm not sure exactly who you are, and this could be...
I am Ed Pawlowski, the mayor of the great city of Allen.
Thank you very much, sir. My deepest apologies. So what I want to do is sort of have a semi-structured discussion here today. I have a series of questions, and we'll just take it from there to see how things go. But once again, the focus of this panel is on issues policy-related. So one of the most hotly contested issues today, as well as since the time of the Moynihan Report was released in the 1960s, was that of the federal minimum wage. And some cities, such as San Francisco, have sort of taken the step to increase the minimum wage at the local level to that of $15 an hour by 2018. At the writing of the Moynihan Report, the minimum wage at that time was $1.25. Since then, the minimum wage has increased at the federal level to $7.25. In spite of such increases, the question is, well, to what extent does the current federal minimum wage actually provide a strong foundation for individuals and families to actually meet their needs? And whoever's daring enough to take this question is more than welcome. Actually, let's actually introduce our last guest who has just arrived. Absolutely, hey. Please welcome Mayor Vaughn D. Spencer of Reading, Pennsylvania. And if anyone wants to take the first question, go in any order, whoever's ready.
Sure. What was the question again?
To what extent does the current minimum wage, the federal minimum wage of $7.25, allow individuals and families to actually meet their minimum needs?
It doesn't. And that's the debate that we're having today. Obviously, the minimum wage is not sufficient. It's not a living wage. It doesn't provide a basis for families to make any sort of living as opposed 50. First off, I want to say thank you for, I was born in 1965, so reminding me that I'm going to turn 50 years old this year through this report. We were still struggling with the same issues that we were struggling 50 years ago. And throughout all the panels that I've been able to sit through this afternoon, and since I got here late, but I sat through the last panel. And, the same issues that we're struggling with 50 years ago, we're struggling with today. And the issue of minimum wage was a hot topic back then. It's still a hot topic today. We have legislators, in both parties that are unwilling to take the step necessary to really look at a living wage that's a true living wage. And, it's sad to look and reread this report and then, really realize that we haven't progressed very far as a nation in 50 years. We're at the same junctures, we're discussing the same issues, and it's almost like history is repeating itself 50 years later. So to answer your question, simple answer is no, it doesn't provide any sort of substantive wage. In Allentown, we've actually tried to push the issue since the state in Pennsylvania prohibits cities like mine and Vaughn's, which are, quote, third-class cities, from doing any sort of ordinance, per se, to push minimum wage. We have followed suit with Philadelphia and actually are trying to lead the way by increasing the minimum wage for our own contractors for the city. So anybody that's contracting with the city of Allentown has to provide a living wage of at least $10.25 an hour. Now, all that does is really affect us, but the hope is that it's going to at least push some folks in the business community to follow suit because the state and the federal government both seem unwilling to really address this issue in any substantive way.
But this is the conversation that we should be having, because when you read the Moynihan Report, if you get sidetracked when we start talking about the Negro family or the African American family, and we'll begin to think that we're talking about cultural issues and slavery and so forth, fundamentally, we're talking about money.
Economics.
We're talking about economics. The reality is, even the whole slave trade was about economics. The issue of helping people is about economics. Now, the reason that the minimum wage is still the issue, but it's not enough. If you recall, Martin Luther King, now, you said you were born in 65, I was born in 64. And so when this came out, we were both just getting here.
Yeah.
And
we were walking around in diapers.
Exactly.
Or crawling around in diapers.
But Martin Luther King, where this $15 an hour piece comes from, is 50 years ago, Martin Luther King was arguing for $2 an hour. When the minimum wage was $1.25, Martin Luther King was arguing for $2 an hour. If you do the inflation, that would give you $15 an hour now. And because we need a living wage. The reality is America is failing on this issue, even in the changing of the guard of the financial gatekeepers. If you think about when I was growing up, the major employer was General Motors. General Motors could give its employees a livable wage, a salary that would allow unskilled workers a track into the middle class. General Motors is not running things anymore. The steel mills are not running things anymore. Walmart is. But Walmart is not paying anywhere near what General Motors paid to the same type of person. So that the major employers in America are not willing, because Walmart, if they wanted to, could pay the same type of wages that General Motors paid. They're just unwilling to. And that is what is keeping the bottom at the bottom. And so we've got to keep the conversation around economics. Martin Luther King was killed for that conversation, not the can we all sing together, live together, go to school together. This is the critical conversation. Can we share the money? And can we share the money across the board?
But it's not just economics, it's education too. It has to be economics and education. Because when you think about, I just gave one of my State of the City speeches, and we talked about something we're doing in Allentown called the Allentown Promise, which is we're putting together an endowment with the community college so that every single kid that graduates from a high school in the city of Allentown will actually have a 2-year college education. And one of the things that I said during that speech was, I said, the greatest community development strategy that we have, the greatest economic development strategy that we have, the greatest poverty reduction strategy that we have is education. Mm-hmm. And it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to raise the minimum wage, but to raise the minimum wage for somebody that's still working at McDonald's, that is not providing the foundation of what this report was talking about. And so we need to have the two really go hand in hand. We need to figure out. It all goes back to economics.
It goes back to economics.
Sure you have the education
to have the education
to have the jobs that are going to be family sustaining.
And if the school that he goes to or she goes to is underfunded, and you come out with a pseudo education,
right,
meaning you graduated, but no university wants you,
right,
and the university that you want to go will not accept you because the education that you received from that underfunded public school did not give you the foundational ability to even do freshman level work. And then that comes back to money and rightly allocating money. And then, of course, we know that conversation in Pennsylvania, without becoming too political, but this fourth one was about politics, when we had administrative will to take $1 billion out of public education. That's what this is about. And so hopefully, with the change of administration, there'll be will to put it back.
Well, and I guess I might as well chime in on this topic. But unlike these two gentlemen, I was born in 1947, and I graduated from high school in 1965. But it is purely economics. For anyone to think today that with a mother and a father working at the current minimum wage, that you're going to be able to sustain a family, you got to be kidding yourself. The economics just isn't there. The numbers don't even jive. And yes, in cities like Ed and myself, we're dealing with school districts that are in crisis. They need more funding from the state. They cut back under the previous administration. They cut back on a lot of the urban schools, and you see what's happening in the city of York school system, which is under receivership or getting ready to go into receivership. We saw the trials and tribulations of the Chester, Pennsylvania, and these things are just going to start creeping around the state, and Reading is just hovering there. But more importantly, how do you provide the type of education to meet the needs of students in the future workforce when you have around the city of Reading suburban schools that put twice as much money per pupil in educating their students as we are in Reading? We're like a little over $7,000, close to $8,000 per pupil. We have a very affluent school district that's doing $15,000 per pupil. These are the obstacles we're faced with. These are the challenges that cities like Reading are faced with, because we have to build a tax base, which means bringing businesses into the area. And the first thing these businesses ask is, well, what's your educational program like? What are your schools like? And then they want to look at test scores and what have you. And then they make the decision, well, you're not having the quality education that we need to move forward. And then let's not even talk about supporting a family. Because if mom and dad are working and they're making $14.50 an hour, then that's less time to spend with their children. And so then we have the issues of where are your kids at, what are they doing, what crowds are they hanging around with. So all these things spiral, and it impacts on communities across Pennsylvania, across the nation. And so my response will be, when we all agree, it's so what? So what is it? What does it mean? So why does it matter? So what do we do? I am the CEO of the Girl Scouts of Eastern Pennsylvania. We actually serve over 40,000 girls in this region, 9 counties in this region. And the Girl Scouts is the oldest girl-serving organization in the world. We're actually in every zip code in America. We're in 92 countries. We are the largest girl-serving organization in the world. We have over 3 million members here in the United States. And what we are doing is we are supporting girls sometimes during schools when we have great relationships with school districts, and we are also supporting girls after school in programs. We are a skills-building organization, and what we know is that, personally I know this because I spent 15 years in education. I'm a lawyer by training and worked with the U.S. Department of Education, the Chicago Public Schools, the Philadelphia Public Schools, and we know that young people really need to build their skills in addition to being educated, which is really not an option. So for my response is that the minimum wage is not enough. Our young people in our communities and our families absolutely need education, but they also need to build skills that will help them become successful global citizens. And I also, before I just stop, I want to say thank you to the university. Thank you to the conveners here for bringing together such an astute group of leaders from around the region to really talk about issues that matter today and issues that matter tomorrow, and helping us reflect on a very important report that was a big topic many years ago and continues to be a topic today. And so thank you.
Are we working? Perfect. So let's stick with things employment related. One of the things that I noted in the Moynihan Report was that in 1965, 29% of black teenage youth were unemployed. 29%, that's a very high proportion. And so as a criminologist, I started thinking that, well, one of the things that we know about employment is that it tends to structure one's time, right? So if you're employed for 8 hours a day during the summertime, that's 8 hours a day that you can't engage in deviant behavior. That's likely 8 hours a day that you also are unable to suffer from some sort of crime victimization. So from your perspective, do you believe that young black males, and I shouldn't say just young black males, but young people of color in general are more or less attached to the workforce today as compared to then? And from your personal experiences, what are the consequences of youth not being engaged in the workforce? And I think you sort of touched on this already, Natalye, but if you care to continue, that'd be great.
What was the question again? There was one word that I missed.
What are the consequences of young people of color not being attached to the workforce?
Well, I think the consequences, well, for us, we work with girls across every social, economic demographics. And, I think the issue of race impacts the issue of work impacts all of us. And so there are many important skills that are learned from getting up and going to work and being on time and working with individuals in a particular workplace, understanding goals, objectives, timelines, resources. And so I think that it impacts children of color as well as impacting any child if they don't have the opportunity to work. And so I think that work is very important and very meaningful, it's something that we should make sure that our children have access to.
I think we have to deepen the analysis of what has happened to the workforce because we have to raise the question, what have we done with our outsourcing that has changed the nature of work and what work is available to teenagers, what work used to be available to teenagers that is now taken by adults. I can almost appreciate McDonald's pushback on the minimum wage discussion when you understand when I was growing up, all the McDonald's jobs were our jobs. They were kid jobs. And so the whole business structure of McDonald's was you pay all these minimum wage salaries, you have this structure, so that's how they built this empire. And so to change the minimum wage for McDonald's workers changes a whole philosophical approach to that whole organization. So I can appreciate the argument. But now the people that are working at McDonald's are people who have families. Those jobs used to be our jobs. The paper boys and paper girls when I was growing up are paper moms and paper dads anymore. The workforce has shifted. So the jobs that were available to us as startup jobs are no longer there. And now we're trying to scrape to find appropriate employment. The mom and pop stores that have been swallowed up by the Walmarts and the Burlingtons and so forth are no longer there. So I think we have to deepen the analysis of what did we do with NAFTA? What did we do with outsourcing that has caused this dearth, which then opens up then other pharmacological opportunities in urban settings to make money. So I think we have to assume some adult responsibility for the context that we have created, and then we have to challenge our young people to be creative because then we also, along with those other opportunities, had opportunities to create. For instance, if you ask me, growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, what color is snow, I would tell you it's green. Because as snow hits the ground, that means me and my shovel are going to make some money. But that is a completely different experience now that I live in Ardmore and it is actually illegal for young people to solicit and to come up and knock on your door and ask, can they shovel your driveway? So things are changing. And we have to deepen the analysis of what have we done to the overall job market and how does that disproportionately impact black and brown youth in poor areas.
Well, and I'd like to piggyback on it because it's a very good comment. Who are we talking about here when we say about there not being enough jobs? I don't have one.
That could be a problem.
But I can speak loud.
Here.
Exactly who are we talking about? Because one of the problems that we're faced with today is that we have a lot of people coming out of school that can't find work. And of course, the natural instinct of people are to survive. When I looked at the Moynihan Report and the time period 50 years ago, 1965, one of the things that was missing was that whole drug culture that was beginning to take effect. And the effect that that culture has had on families, the effect it had on incarceration, that all of these things we're dealing with today. But more importantly, you have a situation where you go to look for a job or you go to apply for a job and they want to know what's your work history. If you haven't been working, you don't have much of a work history. And then the assumption is, well, you must have been sitting around collecting welfare or something, you know. And then it goes from there. And don't have an arrest record, because as we know today with the initiative Ban the Box and all those things that means, you have a record. Now you got to fill out an application. You got to check off that you've been incarcerated or been found guilty of a misdemeanor felony. You check the box, and what happens? Put that on that pile. Next, see the next application. So yes, there are some serious problems with the jobs that are available. Who's taking those jobs? What jobs are left? And what a lot of our young men and women are faced with, if they're not, even if they're going to college, it's getting a job, you know. And of course, the old time, back in the day, you know, you joined the military. Well, you can't even do that anymore, because you've got to come there with skills, and they're not just going to take you like they used to.
That's right.
You know, unless they need a major war breaks out, and then they're going to draft you. But I thought the interesting thing that Professor Moynihan mentioned was how he felt the draft. I don't know if anybody picked up on that. How he felt the draft was like a great thing for people then, because it meant somebody was going off to fight, and there was the potential of you getting training and furthering your education, whether it's through a GI Bill or what have you, after you got out of the service. So when you have to rely on those types of concepts, this society's in trouble.
I did pick that up, but one of the things that was interesting for me, while it shifts the conversation a bit, as he pointed out the draft, I remember the draft, and I remember how the draft forced me into a college mindset and conversation at the age of 5. Because at the age of 5 in 1969, I knew you either go to college or you go to war, and you come back crazy like that guy. Because what we were seeing in the community was, and that's what Marvin Gaye, when he's saying what's going on, or when he's saying mercy, mercy me, what he was talking about is what happened to this beautiful black community that I used to sing in? What happened? What happened to these guys? What's wrong with it? You know, the guys that were coming back in 68, 69, 70 from Vietnam, they were crazy. And those of us in kindergarten, we knew, go to college or die or be crazy. And so the draft for me solidified, there's no other discussion. You finish high school, you go to college. And so the draft was kind of a good thing from that perspective.
So let's drill into this idea of workforce training a little bit more, because, of course, a wonderful way of acquiring some skills prior to graduating from high school would be to essentially get a job. In 2013, Philadelphia experienced a number of what were called flash mobs, if you will. And unfortunately, sort of young people of color were the ones that were seen as primarily responsible for these flash mobs. And this question is specifically for the two mayors on our panel. I was curious about the extent to which you believe that antisocial behavior such as flash mobbing is sort of an outcome of lack of opportunities, specifically the extent to which young people of color are actually able to access employment during the down months when they're outside of school.
Well, first of all, I don't want to make a connection of flash mobbing, because flash mobbing doesn't make any sense to me from the standpoint that in some instances this flash mobbing is part of the black on black crime that we see. I can understand the frustration because of a lack of job opportunities that are out there. And quite frankly, the job training programs, what type of jobs are we training people for? My friend here mentioned before that what jobs are out there that you really can develop the skills to move on to a much better job. Most of these job skill programs are centered around the types of jobs that you see in the community. a lot of the high-end jobs that are out there are going to require some technical school background, even for an apprenticeship in the building trades. You've got to come with some strong math skills, unless you're going into the labor force, and doing a lot of labor work in construction sites. So, it sounds good to have a job training program, but I think the question that we all should be asking ourselves are what are we training our young men and women? What types of jobs are we saying that are out there? And more importantly, how about supporting or funding some of the apprentice programs and some of the computer skill programs that we're going to need to be in this workforce? And I don't know if that's happening. I know in Berks County, with our workforce development component, it's lacking. I truly believe it's lacking. I don't know about Lehigh County.
Absolutely. You looked like you were going to say something.
Well,
you got to jump in. You got two politicians
he said it was
and a
for
preacher,
the two mayors. I'm not a mayor yet, so
I like that.
that was a joke.
She said, not yet.
that was a joke. That was a joke. Well, I actually would like to respond, and my response is really about group deviant behavior. The last panel gave an example about group deviant behavior, and I think a part of that is when it's channeling energy and putting energy towards good or bad, but it's also where there are individuals in the group or the group in and of itself, when people don't feel empowered to speak up and say, this is not right, or I am not going to do X, Y, or Z. And so when you had the issue of, a group of young people flash mobbing, that's group deviant behavior. And I will go back to an organization like the Girl Scouts or other youth building organizations where it's really about character education. For us, we are building girls of courage, confidence, and character who go out and make the world a better place. And I think that if we are empowering our young people with character education and strong values, when they are in a group dynamic, and if there is an instigator in the group, what we really need is someone also within the group who is empowered to stand up and say, no, this is not right, because what we have learned in some education courses is that when you have gangs and groups, you have an instigator, you have a bully, you have that bystander, and you have a silent person who just won't say anything. And so what we really need is more of our silent youth to stand up and say, no, this is not right.
I just want to press on that, and I also want to challenge this room, because I think the flash mob phenomenon also is a study of white privilege, and I'll qualify that, and us sort of understanding youth culture. Let me give as an example. I said I live in Ardmore. I live 5 miles from Villanova. Every year at Villanova, there's this thing that happens on Lancaster Avenue. It's called the Crawl. Now, it's about 100 white Villanova students, and they start at Villanova, and they hit each bar. You go in, you take a drink, you come out, you walk down the street, you go in the next bar, you take a drink, you go all the way from Villanova, all the way down to Brownies, which is right there at the beginning of Ardmore. Now, I don't know what a mob is, but 100 drunk white folk walking down the street is a mob. 100 drunk or high black folk going down the street is a mob. The difference, however, is the culture of the main line affirms this tradition of drunkenness in the streets for these white folk. And as soon as these black kids on South Street look like they're about to do something, the police show up and other things that set it off. The only difference is a larger culture that understands the nature of what that thing is. For me, it would be extremely interesting to see, and I watched it. I watched all these kids just come out and they just get drunker and drunker. And when they got to the end, there were buses from Villanova to take them back home. The difference is a culture who says, these are our kids, they're crazy, we love them, and we're going to make sure nothing happens to them. The other culture says, these are not our kids, they're crazy, they're criminal, and we're going to do something about it. I'm not arguing that either is right in terms of the children, or kids, young people. I'm not arguing that they should be on South Street running up the street, nor am I arguing for this drunken foolishness on the main line. But the difference is how the larger adult culture responds to it. And then only one ever makes it to the media. You've never seen this drunken craziness that happens on Lancaster. You've never seen it on Channel 10. Because if you see it on Channel 10, it will change the nature of what the property value of the houses in that area will go for. So you're never going to see that. That's the stuff we've got to talk about. Because if we begin to look at it, we'll begin to understand kids are kids, young people are young people. Young people do some strange things. I'm sure strange things happen here in Kutztown. But the reality is we look at that so differently. So now it's all over. The flash mobs aren't happening. But what we have is no discussion of Lancaster, a lot of discussion of crazy African Americans who tear up stores. No discussion of what role the police and other larger cultural factors play.
You bring up a very interesting point about the social consequences of behavior, if you will. And what's interesting to me is that when people of color engage in deviant behavior, it becomes sort of a cultural pathology, right? The failed culture of blackness. But when, for example, Timothy McVeigh blows up the Oklahoma City Federal Building, it's an individual failure. Very interesting, and thank you for pointing that out. I want to press forward just a little bit and touch on one other thing relative to issues of employment. So in 2003, sociologist Deborah Pager published a study called The Mark of the Criminal Record, or The Mark of a Criminal Record. And conducting this matched study, she found some interesting things. Of course, having a criminal record makes it a little bit more difficult for you to get a job. She also found that black people without a criminal record had a more difficult time acquiring a job or receiving a call back than whites with a criminal record. Think about that. Okay? Think about that. So with that in mind, I'm curious as to how you all feel about the extent to which people of color still face barriers to entering the workforce, right? So we talked about sort of some of the structural issues, but I think this question taps more so into issues of systemic racism, right? So even if you do have the qualifications to acquire a job, to what extent will you be met with barriers that may keep you from actually acquiring a job?
I think they talked about it a little bit in the last panel as well, and this prison industrial complex that we've created in this country is, and Vaughn touched on it, banning the box. We just announced we're banning the box today. I just had a press conference before I came down here that the city of Allentown is taking the box off all its job applications, and we're banning the box. Mm-hmm. I think it's the right thing to do, and I think it gives everybody at least an equal shot to be able to compete for those jobs, at least within the public sector. And again, we can't mandate it to all the businesses within our municipality because the state doesn't provide us the ability to do that, but at least we can lead the way. But it's interesting. I was reading a Pew Foundation study not too long ago. It said 1 out of every 100 adults in this country now has been in prison or is in prison. Think about that. 1 out of every 100 adults. We have more people in prison than any other country on the face of the planet, including China, which is obviously not the bastion of progressive thought on this globe, right? We spend 6 times more on prisons than we do in education, and in Pennsylvania, that bears out. And I was looking back in 1990, we actually spent $90 million on prisons in the state. Today, in this budget this year, we are spending $1.75 billion. So in a little over 20-something years, we went from 90 million to 1.75 billion, which could have gone back to job training programs, which could have gone back to fund our schools, which could have gone back to help the most impoverished communities within our cities, but is going in to fund this criminal industrial complex. And it is having an impact on jobs, and it's probably adversely having an impact on folks of color. There's no doubt about it. There is no, it's clear that the vast majority of folks that are in this prison complex, industrial complex, are either black or brown, and they're coming out. It becomes a more difficult challenge to get employment, and it just exacerbates the problem that already currently exists within our communities. And I deviated tremendously, and I don't even remember what the question was that you asked, but I do think it's having an impact, and it's a larger problem that we need to address as society, and it's one that we don't want to talk about. We just don't want to talk about. We don't want to talk about prisons. We don't want to talk about, things like flash mobs that cause cultural deviance. I mean, I was silent in the last question because I never thought about it. I never thought about, it was a lack of jobs creating flash mobs. I don't think that's the case. I would agree with you more that it's probably more of a modern expression of social deviance than anything else. And I know, deviating again, but I would disagree with you a little bit that I don't know if it's confined to, just difference of a flash mob to folks of color as opposed to, if it was a flash mob of a bunch of white kids, I'd be just as concerned, because my, thought of a flash mob is they're getting together to cause some sort of trouble, okay? Because most flash mobs have been, they end up beating somebody up or, I don't know what your thought is, but that's, as a mayor, that's my initial thought of a flash mob, okay? I don't care what color they are, it's just, it's not a good thing. But we have to change the course and the direction of our dialogue within this country. And the fact that we're having this discussion, I think, is positive. The fact that I'm going to come full circle, the fact that we're talking about the very same issues that they talked about 50 years ago, and we really have not progressed that far, is troubling. And it's sad. It's saddening, too, that we have not really moved that far ahead as a society. In fact, in many cases, when you talk about folks in prison and you talk about employment and you talk about employment within our communities of color, we've actually digressed. We haven't moved forward. We've actually moved backwards. So I will stop talking. Let somebody else talk.
And I really appreciate your disagreeing with me, and I really appreciate your assumption, and that's exactly what I was talking about, because what you said was that your definition of a flash mob was that they sort of got together to go beat somebody up, and that's the fundamental. Because
that's all you hear about in the press.
Exactly. My contention is, whether we're talking about the kids from Villanova or the kids on South Street, neither group got together to begin to do wrong. I fundamentally believe that. I don't believe that they start out wrong. I believe that there are cultural implications to what we see in our context. What happens when we see a group of, I'll speak for Philadelphia right now. If you see a group, 50 black kids over here or 50 white kids over here, right now things are so tense that the assumption that these 50 black kids are getting ready to do something wrong and these 50 white kids are not. That's the fundamental problem. And then our cultural response to that is then what sets off what happens the rest of the night. If I begin with an assumption, you're going to be all right. Even if you're a little drunk, you're going to be all right. I'm going to respond to you differently. If I think that you're out here to do wrong, I'm responding to you differently. So I'm arguing that the kids are just kids. Our responses have been classically conditioned by what we see in the media, classically conditioned by what we believe some data teaches us, so that certain groups get certain types of attention. And I believe that if you were to take white kids from Villanova, surround them with police who are antagonizing them as they are drinking, by the time they get to Brownies, they're going to tear stuff up as well.
I'll pick up on one of the parts of the questions that you asked, and that had to do with the percentage of African Americans who don't have records, but still, for some other reason, aren't selected for jobs. And I think that goes back to that whole issue. President Obama has touched on it. This nation still dealing with the question and the issue of race. And, Moynihan talked about equality and liberty. And to some people, it means two different things. They might see equality, but they don't necessarily mean that it means liberty, or liberty doesn't necessarily mean equality. The business community, they have what they see as a business plan or a perception of how they see business and how they see their business becoming successful. And obviously, they look at who is their face, so to speak. And there's this perception that we want to have show that we have come a long way and accept people of color, but to a point. In other words, they still feel as though they have to do business with other entities, whether it's other countries, other places in our nation, and how people perceive that whole race issue and who is the face of your business. And I think that until we can resolve further those issues, you're still going to continue to see qualified men and women of color, but aren't necessarily the face of the business because what's their complexion? Are they too black? Or are they a nice brown color? Or what does their hair look like? You can have somebody out in front of your business with dreadlocks on, as opposed to someone with a nice, clean-cut, conservative look. I mean, they're still into that kind of stuff, And, when you think back, Dr. Du Bois said the biggest problem of our century going forward was the problem of color, of race. And it still is. Although we've got Civil Rights Act and all these other things, this still is in the back of a lot of people's minds. And I don't know how you answer that question, or the rationale, how you explain the rationale behind it. But we still don't look at the person and the abilities and the talent that they bring. We're still scrutinizing appearance. You could have two people up there, both of them looking sharp. One person has one look, another person has another look. And they will gravitate to the look that they believe that their clientele would want to see. And that's, so I don't know how I should explain it, because it doesn't make any sense.
I think the one point that I would offer is our perspective is usually based on what we have experienced. So what we see is based on what we have seen. What we see is based on what we have seen. And so I would actually encourage us to try to see something differently, or try to expose ourselves to different experiences so that we broaden our perspective. And I'll just offer a couple of stories, not long stories, but just a couple of examples. I remember when Michelle and Barack Obama were elected, and Michelle Obama's face was all over the media, and people in certain areas would say, "Wow, did anyone ever tell you look like Michelle Obama?" No. But I have another story. Believe it or not, I was at an event the day after Whitney Houston died, and her face was all over the media. And someone came up to me and says, "Wow, did anyone ever tell you look like Whitney Houston?" It's like, no, that's never happened to me. You laugh, but I mean, some of these things are laughable, But I make the comment when you say, well, you know, will people hire an African American who doesn't have a record compared to a Caucasian American who does have a record, and there's something that they see in the Caucasian American, and there's something else that they see in the African American, regardless of what their record is. And what they see is based on what they've been exposed to. And then those small little subtle examples of where good-meaning people would come up and associate me with the image that they've been bombarded of a woman of color. It's they see me based on what they have seen in the recent media.
Thank you.
Thank you. All very interesting comments, but I want to switch gears just a little bit because I'm sure that we are moving very swiftly to the time allotment that we actually have. One of the most controversial issues in the Moynihan Report was this notion of the pathology of the black family that I touched on earlier. And according to Moynihan, central to this pathology is the sort of issue of black households being disproportionately compromised of single females or single female-headed households with children. I want to read you a quote to sort of contextualize this a little bit more. So Moynihan says, "The Negro community has been forced into a matriarchal structure which, because it is so out of line with the rest of American society, seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole." What's interesting about the Moynihan Report to me, which made me scratch my head, was the notion that he says that, right, in the sense that, you know, this idea of matriarchal households are problematic, but he points to all of this sort of statistical data which suggests that people are sort of systematically excluded, and people of color in particular are systematically excluded from the workforce. And so I want to throw the question out there, what's the real issue? Is it that people are systematically excluded from the workforce, or that households of color tend to be disproportionately composed of female leads? Or a combination of both?
I am would be considered a Neanderthal in my theology. So I am a conservative Christian. I believe in the complementarian approach to theological understanding of family. I believe, you know, male, female. I believe I'm the head of my house. I believe that as far as he could see and understand, and speaking from his perspective, there's truth to that, but there's not enough. You'll hear me keep using this. Got to deepen the analysis. What is it about this country and culture that is feeding the emasculation of black male identity? And so I think the two are hand. I would argue our families men need to step up. We need to be in our lives of our children. We need to be in the lives of the community. I argue that all the way. But then we also need to examine what are also the things that are informing why men seem to be challenged disproportionately in our context. That does go back to economics. It does go back to jobs. It goes back to what I believe is innate in every man, to be protector, provider, that language. And when the ability to do that stuff is not there, it just pulls at you. And so I would argue that there are sociological reasons that have attacked the African American male. I think that we still have to deal with the particular way this country deals with African American males, and understand how that impacts how African American males see themselves and how we see ourselves in relationship to women and our community. That does not mean, and where I think he misses, what he missed in the report is, even in the most healthy family, in my definition, we have some understandings of family. One term was the consanguineal patterns from West Africa, where we have much more of not a matriarchal but matrilineal understanding of the family. So that the family, my family may be named Waller, but our inheritance in terms of how we identify more with my wife's family line than mine, even though we have my last name. My wife tends to, and in our families, the females tend to be those that sort of are the coagulants for creating community. But that is consistent with West African patterns of understanding of community. So what he looked in on, he could only see through his lens, as our sister has said, and so he prematurely called a death. I agree with some of his analysis, but some of it is also his ignorance of not understanding culture that predates African peoples on the continent.
Well, I already mentioned when I was born. And of course, in 1965, I was graduating from high school. I can say that in the Reading, Pennsylvania, that I remember growing up in, and families as a whole, black families included, I don't remember many families that didn't have a mother and a father at that time. I mean, there were some, but for the most part, when I played with some of my friends, it was always mom and dad. Now, dad might be working different hours, and then mom would be home, and sometimes mom had to pick up a part-time job with that. But I didn't remember seeing it. But I don't think you can have that discussion, and that's the bone I had to pick with Mr. Moynihan, because he left out completely that whole period of what we saw, the invasion of drugs into neighborhoods and the impact that it had on the black community. And in many aspects. First of all, you had the situation where you had zero tolerance on crime. I remember the zero tolerance on crime issue, and an equal way that it was dealt with. You're in the city, you have 2 pieces of crack cocaine, and they're throwing you in jail for how long. You could be in suburbia with a bag of powder cocaine, and you got your hand smacked, Well, when you incarcerated young men, young women, then you had grandmom and grandfather raising families, at an elderly age. Then you had the situation of children being born and parents being incarcerated, and then now you have foster care situation, and we all know how that became a nightmare, and still is in many large cities. And then you get out of being incarcerated, and as Ed mentioned, City of Reading too. We put a Ban the Box initiative out there. But how do you get employment, when you have those issues? And then we look at the recidivism rate, because dad's coming back, he's reconnecting with family, he wants to be seen as the breadwinner, and all of a sudden he can't find another job, so now you have this continual spiral. And this is what we saw happening in our neighborhoods. We saw high school age kids getting involved in this type of business because that's how you made money. There were no other jobs out there. So we saw this in the large cities, and after a while, Ed, the 222 Corridor Initiative, that's when the drugs were starting to come down 222, Easton, Allentown, Bethlehem, Reading, Lancaster, and it was infesting our community.
But point of clarification, the big invasion of drugs may have started in the late 60s, but it was really a phenomenon in the 70s, and then the inequities in the laws was in the early 80s. So this report really predated that phenomenon in our in American culture.
I hate to disagree with you on that.
Great. I said point of clarification.
We know during the Harlem Renaissance period and the Jazz Age, how many of those performers were indulging in drugs. We know that for a fact. And in those large cities, when I went to college, I went to school with some folks that were smoking pot and doing stuff that I never even heard of, And then let's not talk about the LSD stuff, and hallucinogenic drugs and the impact it had on people's minds and stuff. Yes, where it got to the point where it became like a major epidemic. But I'm talking about the black community. The black community has had experiences in drugs going back to the 30s. But the problem was then you still had strong families, and every now and then you would find one family member that kind of like was like, that's your uncle, but you know, he kind of acts a different way and stuff. But yeah, so I mean, that's the only argument that I would have there. It's always been in our community.
Are we still good on time? I don't want to keep rolling if we should sort of... Oh, no, we're good. We're good? This is really interesting to me. So here's a very simple question. Is there something problematic about critiquing a matriarchal family structure? Is there something problematic about critiquing a matriarchal family structure?
I don't think there's something, I think there's nothing problematic about critiquing a matriarchal family structure any more than it is to critique I don't think that either pattern, single father, single mother, is the ideal structure. Now, I'm speaking out of my theology, and so I believe that God created us male and female. I'm speaking out of my theology. I believe that someone who's brought into the world deserves to experience love of God and humanity's love through the love of a mother and through the love of a father. That is a complete experience. To miss one of those is to necessarily miss. Now, we also understand that none of us, whether two-family or one-parent household, that has never been enough. It has never been enough. The nuclear family by itself is not enough. It is a lie of the bourgeoisie model and a lie of television to think that me, my mom, my dad, and that's it, and I'm going to be all right. We've always needed Cousin Pete, my so-so person I call auntie that I don't know why. But to suggest that we need both male and female and larger community in order to become persons who are fully integrated is what I believe. So I think, again, he was speaking out of his understanding at that time, but it misses the larger discussion.
Can I just try? I'm the only white guy up out here. Okay, so I don't
Yeah,
think
I'm the
that,
only woman up here. So
and
we're in good company.
So we are, and I'm going to agree with you. Okay, I agree with Vaughn. I think you're right. I think it only exacerbated the problem when you got into the 70s, when you got into the 80s, and our drug culture, and then this prison industrial system that it only exacerbated the problem, right? I'm curious on where he got his data, because you're right. I mean, that wasn't the problem when he was writing this. And I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I don't think it's primarily African-American families that have a matriarchal structure, okay? I'm a white Polish guy, all right? My mother was the one who held the family together, okay? My mother was the one who created that sense of community, and today I still know more about my mother's family than I do about my father's family.
Gotcha.
Okay? So I don't think it's just a black thing. I think it's a black thing, white thing. I think it's just women in general are the ones who are the coalescing force behind holding the family together, because we as guys have done such a poor job, I think, of being involved within the family structure, dating back decades upon decades. So, I guess I'm trying. I read the report. I'm trying to figure out what context he's putting this in, and what he's trying to suggest by making those statements. About the community, and I can't put it together, to be quite honest with you. Maybe somebody could help me understand his statements and his context, because you're absolutely correct. What Vaughn is talking about is true, but that didn't happen for at least a decade after this report. I mean, there was drugs around, but Vaughn, you okay? I mean, you testified just a minute ago by saying, hey, when I was growing up back in the 40s and 50s, we had this family structure that was there. I don't care if it was a black community, a white community, it was there, right? Quite honestly, we were growing up in the 80s. Sorry to make you feel old, buddy. We were growing up in the 80s, I mean, there wasn't that many families who were, there was still sort of this basic assumption that there was a mother and a father, but it was deteriorating pretty significantly by that point, okay? And in every community across the board, and probably more so in the black communities and the white communities, just because of all the things and the pressures on those communities that we have talked about this afternoon. But I'm having a hard time piecing together, what his context was, as you were pointing out, and then what he was trying to say, as a result of those statements. And maybe everybody, I'm probably throwing out a question here or making a comment. But.
Yeah, I would just, the one thing that I would add is that Mr. Moynihan's criticism of the family and from a matriarchal standpoint based on gender, I think is flawed.
And I agree with that. I certainly agree with that. In fact, I would argue that that he really didn't even understand who Big Mama was. He didn't know, or Medea, and the real strength of not Medea, but Medea, and that most of us recognize the amazing, and even in my traditional view of family, I don't want it to be lost that I think, particularly in the black community, but not limited to, the strength of African American women is just phenomenal, of what they've had to endure at times because of our absence and at times because of our presence. And so it is to be celebrated, the very unique role. What he was looking at as weakness was actually a vision of strength, much like when we look into hip hop and see ignorance. When you really understand what is birth, there's real genius in its genesis when you understand it. So I just want to affirm that. I think ideally, in any given family structure, we've got male and female, then that family has then extended family, and that extended family has community, and community has a central base found in its faith structure. And so to locate all pathology in just that is flawed. But there's a Khan proverb that says the ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. So to look at how the homes are in any given context is a fair way to look at how this nation is going to be.
I would agree with you, and wonderful comments from all panelists as well. What was interesting to me was that while Moynihan was sort of suggesting that it's important for men of color to adopt sort of conventional Western standards of masculinity, in that sense being, one taking care of one's home and providing money and things of that nature, he also noted that it's very difficult for a person to engage in what typical masculinity would be defined as, because, well, these men have obstacles that they have to overcome to engage in the workforce. But I want to switch gears just a little bit, since we sort of beat this topic up a wee bit much. Let's talk a little bit about criminal justice and detention. So Moynihan provides a little bit of data on school outcomes, noting that in 1960, 1 in 3 youth were actually under some sort of correctional supervision, juvenile detention that may be. So to what extent have we perpetuated that today as compared to sort of reducing the contact that young people have with the criminal justice system?
I think we beat that one up pretty much too. I mean, we talked about, it's only exacerbated the problem. It hasn't decreased. In fact, we've almost institutionalized that aspect of our society and culture, where you have whole communities who have family members or folks who are now incarcerated.
Let me reframe the question just a little bit. To what extent have we sort of perpetuated this through the school-to-prison pipeline?
Well, go ahead. I mean, we have. Go ahead.
Well, it's like when we talked about the flash mobs, and we were kind of conversing amongst ourselves. The mindset is, why are you out there with this group of folks roaming around? Is it because you don't have anything else to do? any programs to get involved in or whatever. You know, we've kind of dropped the ball, particularly with our youth. One of the good things about the war on poverty and stuff was they were making monies available for a lot of different activities, whether it was summer work programs, whether or not it was providing monies that you could have people work in your business and stuff like that. All that's going. So you have a lot of young men and women who don't have anything to occupy their time. The Girl Scouts are there. I worked for the Boy Scouts at one point in my life. You've got boys clubs and things of that nature. However, that they're there, but a lot of these programs are dealing with younger age kids, maybe up to 15 or 16. Now, I'm not talking about the Girl Scouts. I'm talking about some of the other programs, like in Reading, it's the Alba's Boys and Girls Club. As mayor, I always said, well, what are you doing with the kids from like 17 up to 22, the young adults? What activities do we have for them? And surprisingly enough, there aren't any. And so now you have these folks who aren't able to get a job, who are don't have like something to do with their time and stuff, and they're seen wandering around or congregating or what have you. And then you have this image then that, particularly in the city like mine, you have people in the neighborhoods complaining about these folks hanging in the block that are causing trouble. They're not necessarily causing trouble, but they're hanging in the block because what other activities do they have to do? And this goes back to what are we doing to provide things for that demographics of our society, things that they can do, training that they could get, the potential of some type of work or what have you. That group is kind of like out there. And when we look at our crime statistics in the city of Reading, this is where we have a lot of our issues with that age group. 17, 18, dropping out of school, what have you, up to 20, 21, 22. They're in the middle of a lot of the gang activities because then they sometimes get involved with gangs because they have that group identity. And some of the things that go on with that whole following a leader, being considered a part of a group or family, all of those things that they're not getting anywhere else.
To answer your question, I think we have created a pipeline, yes. I mean, we have kids in poor communities who don't have access, and their parents don't have access to adequate jobs, who are going to inadequate schools, who are getting involved in gangs for all kinds of social reasons, then finding themselves being involved with drugs and ending up in prison. So we're creating this circular motion of folks that are cycling through a system that obviously is not healthy, that's destabilizing neighborhoods and whole communities. And yeah, I think we've created a systematic scenario of poverty and disenfranchisement, especially within our urban cores.
Yeah, so I just have to say that there's two sides to that coin. And I agree that if you follow the dollars, if you follow the money in terms of where our governments and our society is investing, they're investing more in prisons as opposed to education. But the other side of that is individual choice. And the African American community is not homogeneous. And what we haven't talked about is the fact that as individuals in families, we do have a choice. And a part of the choices that we make is based on the values in our value system, and either understanding or not clearly understanding the consequences or accepting the consequences based on our choices. And so while yes, from an institutional standpoint, there is a pipeline and many inequities, but we are not just victims that don't have some choice in the actions and the decisions that we make that put us in certain circumstances. And so I just have to say that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because I think that the narrative that the narrative that we are speaking to ourselves is not the same narrative that I was raised with, and therefore there are a lot of us who are falling victim to a system because we don't have internal understanding of how to live in the system. We bought into that the system isn't what it used to be, everything is fine. What I mean is, I'm 50 years old, getting ready to be 51. I was raised with a certain understanding of how things are in America. And you can make it, but here's what you're going to have to do. A black A is a white B in school, meaning if you're going to be considered equal to them, then if they all get B's, you have to get A's. That's just how it is, Alyn, if you're going to make it. If they all run a 4.540, you have to run a 4.440, but your 4.4 may still be called a 4.5. That's how it is, Alyn. Run fast. That's the narrative that black men my age who made it were telling. We stopped telling that narrative. And we started saying, no, everything's equal, just going out there. And then we're getting kids who are getting chopped up. Or how to handle what is still very real. I look my age today, so it doesn't happen anymore. I'm the pastor of a pretty significant church, and I drive a pretty nice car. And when I leave my church and go to where I live, I now can go home. When I was 35, when I was younger, I might be playing basketball in Philly, then I'd drive home. And just as soon as I turned right off of Lancaster right off of City Line Avenue onto Lancaster, I can count on both hands and feet the number of times me and my hoodie got pulled over just for a look-see. But only when they rolled down and I spoke English and was able to acquit myself did I never get a ticket, did just move on until now, 15 years later, when everybody knows who that is and lives over there, it doesn't happen. Now, the reality is, that's the conversation I'd want to have with Mike Brown. That's the conversation I'd want to have with Mike Brown about that day. That's the conversation I'd want to have with a number of young people. But it's also an internal conversation that maybe Mike Brown doesn't want to have with me because I played the game and was successful, and there's a generation saying, you know what, Pastor, we ain't playing that game no more. And we don't want to play that game. And that's part of this piece, too. The exacerbation can also deal with, there's so many in jail around this. This war on drugs was a war on black and brown people because the stop and frisk issue is also laden with racial profiling that is unfair. Can I give an example? I use Villanova again because it's where I live. I use 52nd Street in Philadelphia. So it's on 52nd Street, and you see these 4 white kids in an Altima with Villanova caps. They've just pulled over to the side. This dude comes out on the corner, and he has on a hoodie, has on the cap, runs to the car, hits the car, comes back from the car. The boys are driving away. Police officer is observing the whole thing. Police officer looks at this boy who's been hanging around that corner the whole time. Police officer also sees 4 white kids in an Altima driving on 52nd Street. The problem with how we profile is that police officer sees this kid who's been on this corner all day long. Clearly he knows what he is. Stop and frisk says, go get him. When he stops and frisks him, throws him up against the wall, finds $2,000 in his pocket. There's nothing necessarily illegal about having $2,000 in your pocket, but there is something going on. Nothing happens. He gets stopped and frisked. It's unconstitutional. We're up in arms in the community. Now, when you see 4 white boys on 52nd Street in Philadelphia, the way we think about class and color in this country, 4 white boys in the community is economic development. But if you really want to stop and frisk and get a bust, if you stop that car, they just got the drugs from him. They're getting ready to go back out to Villanova, where the statistics would suggest that black kids and white kids do drugs about the same. We smoke about the same amount of pot, drink about the same amount of beer, but our profiling and who we think to look to get is what makes this type of this stop and frisk profiling problematic, which informs the pipeline. So then the car goes away, this kid gets in trouble. But over the last 2 years, 47% of the stop and frisk in Philadelphia have found nothing or been found unconstitutional because of the scenario that I just put on the table. I think that's one of the issues. And then if you're in jail because of substance abuse, maybe you ought not be in jail. Maybe you ought to be in a rehab. And if the issue is drugs or chemical abuse, maybe we need to be thinking about how to help you as opposed to incarcerate you.
Can I ask a question? I'm curious what my colleagues would say. You know, as a mayor, you have to be pragmatic. That's the one thing I've learned after 10 years being in office. You don't have the luxury to sit around and just debate an issue. You actually have to solve problems most of the time on a daily basis. So we're not sitting here 50 years from now and having our grandkids talk about the same conversation.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to change the public discourse that we're having around this issue, so that 50 years from now it's not the same thing, with different faces, different folks sitting here discussing the same issues, and the fact that we haven't really progressed forward, as a society. Just curious what everybody's thoughts are. Sorry, I'm taking over your job.
I actually believe we have to revisit our interpretation of the First Amendment stuff around church and state. I honestly believe that we have fought so hard to protect the church and state dialogue that some of the benefits of whatever religion or faith communities, in partnership with institutions and creating safe spaces that can save us economically, we can begin to use. For instance, being able to fund and do things with young people and create the things that we say are the programs that are missing. We've got, and that the cities can't afford to hold up anymore. Okay, well, we got lots of churches around in every city that a lot of these programs could happen in, and that we could work together to do, and could do them at maybe a fraction of the cost of having it in that city building or so forth. But our language and how we think the Constitution says we can't work together on programming. I'm not talking about religious programming, just talking about practical programming. I think we have to have the will to step in there again. Let me give as an example. We lost funding in Martin Luther King High School for music in the Martin Luther King High School. I believe that music is inherently humanizing. We needed to have that program back. I sent my minister of music into the school. He was a former teacher. We worked it so that he works for Martin Luther King High School but is paid by the church, so that he put the program back in the school. Now, the sniff test of state versus state and church, the first sniff test would suggest to people, you can't do that. But you can if everybody has goodwill to follow the process through and check it for legitimacy along the way. But we tend to back away before we get in the mud with it. And I think that there are more things like that, and I'm not speaking specifically Christian. They're wonderful Jewish, Muslim, Christian. I'm talking about places of people of goodwill with houses or whatever you call them that can come together for the programming that we say has been lost, that we can come back together to put that program back in place.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I would recommend, first of all, I think a part of the root cause is education and economic development. Mm-hmm. And so we really focus on education and economic development. But what we can do individually, collectively, and respectively, I encourage people, it's called the power of one. Mm. Today, you have heard a lot. If you take one idea, one recommendation, one something that resonates with you, commit to it and do it, it moves us all forward. So it's the power of one. So what one thing did you hear today that you're going to commit to and move forward? But I do think the bigger issue is the root cause of education and economic development.
Thank you. At this point, we'd like to open the floor for questions. Questions. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Given our discussion and to talk about bystanders, I typically would not say anything in this scenario, but I wanted to try to make a point about something that I noticed throughout the day regarding assumptions, that they're very dangerous and that they can perpetuate ideas that are untrue, and they're very easy to make. So I wanted to say that I personally am going to try and move forward with theories and questioning those things and finding the sources that can guide me. I also was thinking that given my status as a white woman, it's been easy for me to kind of not ignore, but be a bystander in the situation because I have not experienced oppression in the same way. And I want to recognize that people need guidance and people need you to speak up. People can be inherently good, but they also need the encouragement of others. So hopefully that's along the same lines. But thank you for everything. Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you. Excellent.
Hi, panel. First, thank you for a well-said discussion. Pastor, I have to agree with you on something you said. You said the game, and I kept thinking that's probably the biggest problem in like the whole culture and community. The problem is people, they play too much, and then you get to the point like, when are you gonna quit? Like, did anybody ever teach you to quit? Because you keep going to the point where it doesn't end, and it ends up getting you put in a predicament where you can't get yourself out of. I saw the statistic earlier, and I said, the biggest problem was mindset. The teacher said it. And when you come back to it, it's like game's another issue. They keep playing around. Like, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said you have to have a discussion with the young black men in your community, or really generally the young men in your community. Like, because a lot of them get differential association with, like, they learn from one another. Well, the problem is, if you keep teaching this and you don't find a way to kill it, it's going to become a bigger problem. And it's already on a national stage. So the problem is, it's not just played in this country, it's played in almost every other country. But the problem is, it causes a lot of problems where if it's not solved, it's going to keep causing a big issue. And if it gets out of hand, it's already gotten out of hand, actually, I should say. And that if we don't find a way to actually, we don't find a way to actually, like the mayor said, you can't just talk about the problems, you got to actually deal with them. If we don't find a way to deal with it, it's going to get to the point where it's never going to end. They're like, where do you draw the line? It's really what I'm trying to say. Is like, the question is, where do you end up drawing the line? That scenario you gave, actually, it holds true in a lot of places. Like, you want to stop him, but yet you want to let those four drive off with the drugs. I'm like, who's more of a danger? Those got drugs, and your drugs cloud your judgment, and they make you do things you're not supposed to do, you're gonna regret. Well, he's got $2 grand on him, and they got drugs. Like, where do you draw the line? You gonna let the four of them walk off, drive off, and he's gonna be the one who gets stopped? There's an issue. Like, that what he just said is a real issue, and it digs deeper than just those two. It just digs deeper than just the game that an assumption, or you're picking and choosing your poison as a law enforcement official. But, and again, these roots in the mindset of the young men, like, you get the idea, like, oh, the one teacher said, my uncle's in jail, my father's in jail. Well, you got to get them out of that mindset. You got to literally inherently get them to stop thinking like that. No, you can change it and get better. Problem is, where do you get them to start acting better and get them to realize I can be? That's the question.
Well, I think the answer is, and the mayor and I actually had an experience with it up here. I believe we have to have closed-door conversations in open context, and not necessarily be politically correct. If you'll notice my language, I was not trying to be offensive, but I used language. I said, white boys, black guys. I was not trying to be offensive, but neither was I trying to be politically correct, because I wanted to challenge the room. Then when I talk, and I think we need to speak about our own experience so that gives someone permission to say, hey, that's my experience too. I talked about the consanguineal West African patterns, the matrilineal experience of the black community. Then the mayor said, whoa, that's not just you all. My mom was like that. My mom was such and such. I think as we dare to speak truth, but only dare to speak our truth, then we give permission to others to join in and speak their truth. And we begin to find out that, you know what, my truth is true, but it's not only true for me. There's something else to this conversation. So my intentionality of being somewhat incendiary was inviting you to think, but keeping it to my experience was not trying to universalize the black experience, but inviting someone else to either identify with it or challenge it. And then the mayor said, listen, we're the same age. I had a mom just like you. You're from Ohio. I'm from around here. But in this conversation, we've got something in common. And those are the blocks to begin to build. And hopefully that means, now I've never turned left I've never been out here before. Every time I've gotten off Northeast Extension, I go east on, so I've never come this way. But that experience has to cause me to say, I've got to think differently because of this experience. And you have to think differently after you've been exposed to somebody else's world. I've got to think differently about how I talk about the African American mothers and so forth, and consanguineal and matrilineal experience, because my Polish brother said, listen, when you tell that story, understand Polish moms are like that too. And I think that's what this is supposed to do, and we're supposed to carry this conversation on. That's how we can end the game.
Hi. I wanted to touch on a couple of subjects that were brought up today. I was here for the last two panels. And I think that a lot of racial issues I look at as cultural issues and economic issues. That's where they're based. That's where they stem from. And I feel like the racial issue is really pushed, it's fueled from anger and frustration, and it's understood, but a lot of it needs to be fueled with love and positivity, because when it's not, it makes things more negative. You know, you can't add up and still expect something positive when you're fueling something with aggression. And that's the way the world works, and people refuse to realize that. And then it comes to when you say, how can we get these kids to realize that this isn't the case? Like, there is no, we shouldn't separate. Separate isn't equal. So I think when we categorize ourselves as white, black, Asian, blue, purple, whatever you want to call it, we're separate, we're not equal. If we got together for a cause more as, this is humanity, let's keep it humane, let's keep ourselves positive, let's keep ourselves as one. I believe that there's one love, and there's strengths of it, and all we are, when we really get down to it, we're light and love, and people refuse to realize that because they're hollow and dark. But if we can constructively spread our positivity, we can enlighten those people that are filled with nothing and darkness. And that's where it all comes from. It's love and pain. And racism, anything, sexism, all those things, it's just categorizing. We're all human. We're all people. And that's where the world gets confused. Well, no, I want to stick up for this. No, like, I want to stick up for everybody. I want everybody to have equal. I don't want us to categorize ourselves. And we need to start at a young age. The economics, the education system, we should have more things in place where kids understand other people's perceptions, that everyone has their own reality. It'll open their minds more if we do that at a young age. It'll spread positivity. It'll open people to new things, because when you're a product of your environment, but if we change the influences that create that environment, that's when we'll see real positive change.
Can I pick up on that and just I want to echo what you said, okay? Because I think you made a really powerful point, and that is we have the ability to, all of us, to make that difference, to make that change. You know, one of the things that I did when I first came in to office a couple terms ago now was I had instituted a faith-based initiative program, okay? And I challenged the churches, because we have so many of them. You know, we have close to 300 churches within the city, that you know, to try to work out programs to really help affect our youth. And so there was one church on the east side of my city that picked up a midnight basketball program, and they started this midnight basketball program, and they called it Amen, okay, Allentown Mentoring Initiative Enrichment Network, okay, and I say that because out of that there was a young girl, her name was Jaquita, and she actually was the only girl that was involved in the midnight basketball program, right? I mean, she was tough, and she had a life experience where she was caught up in that cycle that we talked about. She came from a broken home. She was pushed around through foster kids. She was abused. You know, no one wanted her because, you know, she was a really tough person. She was failing in high school. She was dropping out, and she was just going to be another statistic. To your point, all right, some folks in that program within the community said, you know, we're going to stop this cycle. We're going to stop this pattern. They took her under her wing. I interviewed her because I do a radio show on a local public radio station, and you know, she turned her life around. I mean, reaching out, having that impact, that one person reaching out, that church making an impact in the community, and then the folks in that church saying, we're going to break this cycle, changed that girl's life. She's now a straight A student. She's going, you know, to college. She wants to be a lawyer, even though I tried to dissuade her from that. She was very intent to still being a lawyer. But, you know, it changed her life around. And so, you know, I think exactly to your point, and to your point, to break this cycle 50 years from now, you know, it really is going to be contingent upon all of us in this room to take that step, to be that person, to take that one thing, and really break, you know, that cycle that we see, you know, folks coming into, because that in of itself will have a ripple effect that will change society. It ain't going to come from City Hall. It ain't going to come from the state capitol. It ain't going to come from Washington. We've tried it. It doesn't work. Right. You know, it's going to come from us taking that collective responsibility and really making an impact to change our communities and the course of what's happening within our communities. I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm preaching now, but
Well,
take your role.
I usually don't disagree with my friend Ed up in Allentown, but I think it's more than that. I think that in the next 50 years, this country, particularly the federal government, is going to have to refocus. You have a nation whose infrastructure is in deplorable condition. You have a nation where, because of economic decisions, we're becoming more have and have-nots. The one great thing about the 50s was the development of the middle class. That is slowly dwindling away. And because of that, we're seeing issues around the country that's impacting on communities. We've got to look to see how we're spending our monies, the amount of money that we're sending overseas for various defense initiatives and what have you, where you have cities like the Reddings and other cities in this nation who have no money to provide opportunities for the people in their communities. it's just a matter of time before you're going to see more and more people come out of being incarcerated. We're starting to see that now. You're looking at the amount of juveniles that were sentenced to life sentences for acts that they committed when they were juveniles. Supreme Court is looking at that whole issue. So you're going to start seeing more of an influx in our communities. And the big question is, how do you expect mayors of a city to deal with these problems? How do you expect states to deal with these problems? Here in the state of Pennsylvania, they're looking at what? Billions of dollars. You know, all I'm saying is that, now I'm talking about going forward, just like the last 50 years and the next 50 years. There's got to be a paradigm shift in how we're providing funding, whether or not we need to look and partner with institutions in our community that are meeting the needs of our youth and provide them with the assistance that they need to move forward. But if we continue down the pike that we're going now, you're seeing cities going bankrupt and all those other issues.
Time for one more question.
It's not really a question. It's just a comment on the woman-headed households and single-parent households. One of the biggest issues with that is that women don't get the same wage as a man does. That really impedes what they can do. They have to work harder. They have to work longer hours. And that doesn't make it easy for them to keep the wages that they need to keep the household going and moving. So they're not at home. They're not with their family. They're not with the kids. They're not sitting down and doing the homework with them. They're not keeping them off the streets. They don't know what they're doing when they're not home. So that creates a huge issue with it. And so I don't think there's an issue with women-headed households. I know a lot of very strong women who are heading the households. But it's the fact that they aren't given the same opportunities. And it's all an equality issue.
I would agree. Yeah, but just real quick, I agree with Vaughn. We have to obviously, we have to have more resources to these issues. But my point being is that you can come out of these discussions, okay, feeling in some cases depressed, right? We're never going to be able to solve these problems. We all have the ability to at least make, you know what, we're never going to systematically solve the problems for all our communities, okay? But we can start solving the problems on our block, you know, in our backyards, you know, with, you know, becoming, you know, a leader of a Girl Scout troop and, you know, making, trying to push you there a little, you know, making a difference, you know, in a bunch of kids' lives. That's how we change the whole discourse of this, so we're not here 50 years from now having the same discussion.
Amen.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. A round for our panelists, please. I would like to thank you for attending today's forum. It was a great success. It exceeded my dreams and hopes when my commission and I put this together. So give yourselves an applause. And thank you all very much for coming. Please, if you have any other comments or ideas, please email me, because we would love to do this again. And my kids, we're still having class, so head over to the room. I'll be there.